How does it feel to be a broke, pathetic soldier? Olivia, my younger sister, the girl I had spent my entire youth raising, threw that insult right in my face in the middle of Christmas dinner. Her husband laughed along, mocking me for being stuck in a military camp counting every meager penny of my pension. I sat there looking at the designer bag she had just unboxed and the sprawling mansion she was living in. They had no idea that this luxurious facade was built entirely on my blood, sweat, tears, and 15 years of my youth. I wasn't angry. I calmly set down my wine glass, smiled, and replied, "Then how will it feel, knowing that this broke soldier won't be paying a single one of your bills ever again?" The exact moment I said those words, my sister's smile froze her face, turning deathly pale. The fork in her husband's hand clattered loudly onto his plate. His arrogance vanished, instantly replaced by a look of sheer. But their nightmare was only just beginning, because they had no idea that I was about to officially launch the operation. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if this story resonates with you. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my truck so tightly my knuckles turned stark white, the heavy tires crunching violently over the treacherous ice-slicked roads. The windshield wipers violently slashed away the heavy accumulating snow, but the storm outside was deafeningly quiet compared to the vicious echo of my sister's insults still ringing relentlessly in my ears. A poor, pathetic soldier. That phrase looped on repeat, each repetition slicing deeper than the last. I had survived mortar rounds and hostile waters, but nothing in my career had ever hit as hard as those 5 words from the mouth of the person I had sacrificed everything to protect. My jaw locked tight. The tendons in my neck strained against the collar of my coat. I pressed the accelerator harder, the engine groaning under the effort, desperate to put distance between me and that poisoned mansion. Then, like a physical blow to the chest, the psychological transition hit. I was no longer sitting in my freezing truck. I was suddenly transported back, standing in a sterile, blindingly white hospital room exactly 15 years ago. The pungent chemical smell of rubbing alcohol and bleached linens filled my lungs, suffocating me with grief. The heart monitor beeped in a slow, agonizing rhythm. I looked down to see my mother's frail, bruised, and dying hand gripping the pristine, heavily starched sleeve of my newly commissioned Navy uniform. Her skin was paper-thin, the veins a faded map of a life spent working double shifts at the textile factory so her 2 daughters could eat. She had never once complained. She had never once asked for anything in return. And now she was dying in a county hospital because she had refused to spend money on her own health screenings, choosing instead to put every spare dollar into our school lunches and winter coats. Her eyes were clouded with medication, desperate and filled with a profound terror that I instinctively absorbed into my own soul. She did not look at my rank insignia. She did not ask me to be a hero for my country or to survive the wars ahead. Instead, she gave me a singular, inescapable mission that would dictate the entire trajectory of my adult life, binding me in invisible chains. Her dying breaths were incredibly fragile, a horrifying rattling sound deep in her chest, but her final command was absolute and unyielding. "Take care of your sister. She is too young." My mother whispered, her grip tightening on my sleeve with a sudden surge of adrenaline before going completely devastatingly slack. That single agonizing sentence became my supreme military order. I spent the next 15 grueling years honoring it with blind, unquestioning loyalty. As I drove through the snow, I visualized the brutal, soul-crushing deployments I endured to keep that promise. I remembered eating cold, flavorless MREs on a pitching aircraft carrier deck in the middle of a typhoon, my stomach churning from both the waves and the guilt of being so far from the sister who supposedly needed me. I remembered enduring bone-chilling night watches in hostile pirate-infested waters, volunteering for every dangerous patrol, bleeding for the extra hazard pay just to meet my sister's increasing demands. The phone calls always came at the worst possible moments, 3 in the morning, my time. Her voice dripping with rehearsed desperation, claiming Tommy needed braces, claiming Emma's school was raising fees, claiming the roof was leaking and the contractor needed payment up front. And every single cent of that hazard pay, every drop of blood money was wired straight back to the mainland without a second thought. It funded my sister's endless parade of designer handbags, her lavish tropical vacations to resorts I would never see, the Porsche she parked in the driveway like a gleaming trophy. The entire pathetic illusion of her self-made upper-class lifestyle that she broadcast to thousands of followers online. She lived like a pampered queen in a mansion, building a fake social media empire of curated perfection, while I slept on hard steel bunks in a floating steel coffin entirely isolated from the civilian world. My blind honor had unwittingly created a monster. And tonight that monster had finally shown me its true, ungrateful face. The bitter memory shattered abruptly as I finally pulled into my silent, snow-covered driveway just before dawn. My house was entirely dark, a stark, sobering contrast to the garish, obnoxious holiday lights of the mansion I had just abandoned. I did not bother taking off my heavy, snow-caked boots. I marched straight down the hallway into my study, the air inside freezing and stale. I dropped heavily to one knee on the hardwood floor and aggressively spun the heavy freezing dial on my steel military safe. The complex locking mechanism clanked open with a satisfying heavy metallic thud. Inside this vault, there were no shiny metals, no framed commendations, and no classified tactical maps. There were only flawless, meticulous financial ledgers that I had kept out of pure military habit, every receipt cataloged, every transfer logged, every lie documented without knowing it. I aggressively pulled out the incredibly thick stacks of bank statements, tossing them onto the center of my mahogany desk. The paper felt incredibly heavy, weighted with 15 years of betrayal. I traced my calloused finger over the printed columns, each line a record of my own naive subjugation. Tuition checks to a private school that charged $40,000 a year for an education my sister claimed was non-negotiable, while she herself never finished community college. Luxury condo deposits for an apartment my sister used solely as a backdrop for her social media photos, a place she visited twice a month to shoot content and left empty the rest of the time, while I paid the full rent. Astronomical car payments on vehicles I never drove and never sat in, emergency bailouts that conveniently coincided with designer bag launches, and resort booking deadlines, always accompanied by the same breathless voicemail claiming the kids were sick or the furnace had broken. I remembered one specific call from 8 years ago that now burned in my memory with fresh clarity. I had just finished a 72-hour alert rotation during a particularly dangerous stretch in the South China Sea. My eyes were raw from staring at radar screens. My uniform reeked of sweat and stale recycled air. The satellite phone rang in the middle of the night, and my sister's voice came through crackling with fake panic. She told me Tommy had been rushed to the emergency room with a high fever, and she could not afford the hospital bill. I authorized a $5,000 emergency wire transfer without asking a single question. 2 weeks later, while scrolling through her public social media feed during a rare moment of shore leave, I found a photo of her posted the exact same day she had called me crying. She was lounging poolside at a 5-star resort in Cancun holding a cocktail. The caption reading #blessed, #selfmade, #living my best life. Tommy had never been to the emergency room. The fever was a lie. The $5,000 bought her a vacation. Each line item on my desk was a jagged knife twisting in my back. I booted up my tactical laptop, the screen's harsh, unforgiving blue light casting a ghostly glow over my hardened, exhausted face. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing with surgical speed, inputting the final devastating calculations into the master spreadsheet. I was tallying every single cent I had bled to keep her fake empire afloat since the day our mother died. The columns grew longer. The numbers climbed higher. Foreign deployment bonuses, hazard pay supplements, combat zone tax exclusions I could have invested. All of it funneled directly into her open, greedy hands. The final total flashed on the screen in cold, bold black numbers. $1,150,000. The sheer terrifying magnitude of the exploitation struck me like a physical blow to the sternum, knocking the wind out of me. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking under the sudden shift of weight. 1.15 million. That number represented every sleepless night on a rolling carrier deck, every missed holiday, every birthday I celebrated alone with a cold cup of instant coffee while she popped champagne in a ballroom I paid for. The blind, pathetic honor that kept me chained to my mother's dying promise died in that exact millisecond. It evaporated, replaced by something entirely different, something sharp and clean and cold. I reached up and violently wiped away a single treacherous tear that dared to escape my eye. My lingering grief crystallized instantly into pure, unadulterated tactical resolve. The soft, forgiving civilian in me was dead. The Iron Commander was awake, and she was calculating the exact trajectory for maximum collateral damage. I reached for my encrypted phone, initiating the military campaign to permanently sever the enemy's supply line. Shortly after that grueling holiday, the civilian city returned to work. But I returned to war. I stepped into my Naval Command office, immediately enveloped by the comforting, unyielding rigidity of military protocol. The sharp salutes in the hallway, the pristine uniforms, and the iron discipline of my troops provided a deeply stabilizing contrast to the civilian chaos and entitlement of my sister. I sat at my heavy metal desk, the cold surface grounding me. I completely bypassed my personal cell phone, pushing it to the far edge of the desk where I could not see the screen. Instead, I picked up the heavy receiver of the secure encrypted line connected directly to the military bank's executive branch. I was no longer a grieving sibling offering pathetic handouts to keep the peace. I was a commanding officer identifying and neutralizing a parasitic threat to my own survival. I took a slow, tactical breath, completely compartmentalizing my emotions, locking away any lingering pity into a mental vault. I was about to initiate a strike that could not be undone. Speaking with cold, measured, and terrifying authority, I bypassed the standard operators and ordered the military bank representative to execute an immediate total cancellation of all automated transfers. I instructed them to permanently freeze every secondary credit card and sever all civilian-linked accounts operating under my sister's possession. I commanded them to implement a zero-tolerance block on any overdraft requests, ensuring not a single penny could slip through the cracks. No grace period, no warnings, no exceptions. As the clerk frantically typed on their end, verbally confirming the execution of my orders one by one, a dark memory surfaced. I remembered my sister's relentless, entitled voice on the phone 3 years prior, her tone dripping with rehearsed urgency, demanding just a little more for the kids' private school, while I later discovered she was simultaneously booking a first-class flight to the Bahamas with the exact same transfer. She had lied about the children's needs to fund her vacation. That specific memory burned away the last microscopic shred of my hesitation. It only served to solidify my absolute lack of mercy. I hung up the heavy receiver, the loud click echoing through the quiet office like the chambering of a round. The trap was officially set. The financial oxygen had been cut off. Miles away from the austere discipline of my naval base, my sister strutted through a high-end, glittering shopping mall, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine that had just dropped on her neck. She was deep into a post-holiday spending spree, arrogantly carrying towers of heavy branded designer boxes to the checkout counter of a luxury boutique. Her chin lifted her walk, the practiced saunter of someone accustomed to being served. She flashed her manufactured, entitled smile at the subservient staff and carelessly swiped her familiar platinum credit card. A sharp, loud, and incredibly embarrassing error beep echoed through the quiet boutique, cutting through the soft background music like a fire alarm. The cashier's fingers froze above the register. She glanced down at the screen, then up at my sister, then back down again, clearly hoping the display would change. It did not. She awkwardly cleared her throat, leaning forward slightly, and quietly informed her that the card was declined. The word declined hung in the air between them like a slap. My sister's manufactured smile vanished, instantly replaced by the first crack of confusion she had ever experienced in a checkout line. She snatched the card back, her face flushing red. "Try it again. Your machine is obviously broken," she snapped with venomous arrogance. She violently swiped a second card. Declined. Then a third card. Declined. Every single one. The affluent crowd in the boutique began to stare, whispering behind their hands, as her manufactured upper-class facade publicly crumbled into pathetic humiliation right there in the checkout line. A woman behind her sighed impatiently. The sales associate slowly began to pull back the designer boxes. My sister was left standing with nothing but empty plastic and a face flushed with the kind of shame she had never tasted before. Back in the absolute silence of my office, my private cell phone began to vibrate violently against the metal desk. I let it ring 3 times, watching the screen pulse with her name before I picked it up. Her voice was shrill, frantic, and dripping with a toxic mixture of entitled rage and rising panic. "Catherine, what the hell is wrong with the banking system? All my cards are frozen. The bank says they're locked. Call them and fix this right now. I'm stuck at the mall." I leaned back slowly in my leather chair, turning to watch the gray, freezing ocean waves crash violently against the concrete barriers of the naval base outside my window. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I spoke with the chilling, detached precision of a sniper gently pulling the trigger. There is no technical error, Olivia. The aid operation has officially ended. Happy New Year. Time to stand on your own 2 feet. I terminated the call immediately, permanently blocking her number from my device. Then I set the phone face down on the metal desk and returned to my work. The line was dead. The war had begun. Just hours after the credit card block, they dared to storm my fortress. My loyal subordinate, Lieutenant Vance, strode briskly into my office, his face tight with professional concern. He notified me that 2 civilians were causing a severe escalating disturbance at the main gates, aggressively screaming at the armed sentries and demanding to see Commander Perez immediately. The sentries were requesting authorization to engage. I calmly stood up, my face an impenetrable mask of stone. I donned my heavy uniform jacket, carefully adjusting my rank insignia and ensuring every button was perfectly aligned. As I marched out of the command center and across the freezing tarmac toward the reinforced guard station, a visceral, sickening flashback hit me. I remembered them barging into my tiny, cramped apartment 6 years ago, completely ignoring my exhaustion after a grueling 24-hour shift, banging on my door at 11 at night, demanding rent money for a lease they had signed without telling me. My brother-in-law had dropped onto my couch without being invited, put his muddy shoes on my coffee table, and criticized my worn-out furniture, while my sister rifled through my mail looking for my bank statements. They had always treated my boundaries like a joke. They had always treated my home like an extension of their entitlement. But not today. Today, they had foolishly stepped out of their safe suburban bubble and directly onto federal military territory, where my authority was not a suggestion, but an absolute law. The exact moment I stepped out from behind the imposing barbed wire barricade, my sister lunged forward. Her face was twisted in a hideous, ugly mask of entitled rage, her expensive designer coat flapping wildly in the freezing coastal wind. She immediately launched her most potent, weaponized guilt trip, screaming hysterically, "Have you lost your mind? Do you have any idea how humiliated I was? Mom told you to take care of me. Especially during the holidays, you're just going to abandon your own family." My brother-in-law puffed out his chest, stepping forward to project a pathetic, utterly fake authority, loudly demanding I fulfill my family responsibility and fix what he called the bank error. He jabbed his finger toward the gate as if he had any right to make demands on a military installation. I stood perfectly still, an immovable object. I did not interrupt her tantrum. I did not defend myself. I let their chaotic, pathetic civilian screaming crash pointlessly against my absolute, unyielding military discipline. I counted their arguments the way I would count incoming rounds, tracking each one, letting them exhaust their ammunition. When they finally paused to gasp for air, I moved. I did not argue with them. I did not offer a single word of justification or engage in their toxic emotional warfare. Slowly and deliberately, maintaining eye contact with my sister, I reached inside the deep breast pocket of my coat. I pulled out the massive, heavily stapled stack of audited bank statements I had printed that morning. With a sudden, explosive motion fueled by 15 years of suppressed rage, I slammed the thick stack of papers down onto the pristine hood of their luxury car. The violent sound cracked like a gunshot in the freezing air, making them both flinch violently. My sister's mouth snapped shut mid-sentence. My brother-in-law staggered back a half step. $1,150,000. I growled, my voice dangerously low, slicing through her hysterical crying like a serrated blade. That is the price of the responsibility I paid for your delusional lifestyle. Mom told me to help my sister get an education, not to bankroll a princess and her useless husband for 15 years. My sister stammered, her jaw dropping open. Her eyes darted around in sheer, unadulterated panic as her core manipulation tactic was shredded into confetti in front of the highly armed guards, who watched the scene with stone-cold professional indifference. I stepped directly into her personal space, closing the distance until she was forced to look up at me. My eyes were entirely devoid of any warmth or familial love. Family is not a gold mine for you to exploit. I commanded, my tone freezing the blood in her veins. I took a deliberate half-step back and delivered my final lethal order. If you do not leave this federal installation in exactly 10 seconds, I will order the military police to arrest you both for threatening national security. I nodded sharply to the guards. The sentries instantly stepped forward in unison, their hands resting on their tactical gear. The sheer naked terror in my sister's eyes was magnificent. all of her arrogance drained out of her face in a single heartbeat, replaced by the raw animal fear of someone who had finally walked into a cage she could not manipulate her way out of. They scrambled frantically into their car, my brother-in-law fumbling with the keys so badly he dropped them twice in the snow. The tires shrieked against the frozen asphalt as they peeled away from the gates, finally realizing my power over them was absolute. The sentries returned to their posts. Vance appeared silently at my shoulder. I turned on my heel and marched back into my command center without looking back. Weeks passed in deafening silence, and the catastrophic avalanche of holiday bills finally impacted their household with the force of a bomb. Without my endless military funds acting as a protective financial dam, their bank accounts plunged into the severe negative instantly. From the desolate, freezing deck of a naval ship during a classified deployment, I stared out at the pitch-black ocean, the icy salt spray stinging my cheeks. I remembered the countless holidays I spent completely isolated out here, shivering in the wind, eating reconstituted turkey dinners from sealed packets on metal trays, while watching other sailors video call their families just so my sister could feast on expensive catering and post photos of her fake perfection to an audience of envious strangers. Now the tables had violently turned. The financial walls were rapidly closing in on their empire of lies. My loyal subordinate informed me through encrypted channels that they were receiving dozens of automated aggressive calls a day from angry creditors. Collection agencies were mailing thick envelopes of red-stamped warnings. The protective, luxurious bubble I had stupidly maintained for a decade and a half had evaporated overnight. They were drowning in a stormy sea of debt they had created with their own hands, and I had decisively cut the lifeline. The first major casualty of my starvation tactic was her absolute pride and joy. The finance company, tired of ignored warnings and unanswered calls, dispatched a heavy-duty tow truck to their manicured, snow-covered driveway on a Tuesday morning. My sister stood on her pristine lawn in sheer paralyzed agony, clutching her expensive cashmere coat as she watched the heavy hydraulic winch hook violently onto the undercarriage of her prized Porsche Cayenne. She screamed hysterically at the repo man, a thick-necked man in a stained jacket, who had clearly done this 1,000 times before. She demanded he stop. She threatened to sue him. She told him she would have his job. The man simply handed her the bright pink overdue notice with a look of utter indifference and climbed back into his truck cab. The luxury vehicle was dragged away backward down the driveway in broad daylight, its undercarriage scraping against the concrete curb with an agonizing metallic shriek for the entire judgmental affluent neighborhood to see from behind their curtained windows. The glittering metal crown of her manufactured success was violently ripped away, leaving her standing alone in the freezing slush, totally exposed as a fraud to the very society she had tried so desperately to impress. Complete and utter desperation set in at their freezing home. My brother-in-law, entirely stripped of his fake executive arrogance and expensive tailored suits, realized his meager administrative office salary could not even cover basic survival groceries for his 2 growing children, let alone the mortgage, the utilities, and the mountain of credit card debt. Swallowing his immense pathetic pride, he applied for a humiliating cashier job at the local supermarket to earn desperately needed daily cash. He was forced to don a cheap, itchy polyester uniform with a name tag pinned crookedly to his chest, a far cry from the silk ties and Italian leather shoes he used to wear when pretending to be a successful businessman at my sister's dinner parties. Before his very first shift even began, the grim store manager handed him a rusty snow shovel and pointed at the entrance. He spent his entire morning painfully shoveling dirty gray salt-stained snow from the store's entrance, his back aching, his soft, uncalloused hands quickly blistering and splitting in the freezing wind. He tasted the bitter, humiliating reality of hard, grueling manual labor for the very first time in his sheltered, pampered life. Through all of their escalating suffering, I maintained an absolute ironclad radio silence. I was a ghost. My loyal subordinate Vance sent me highly encrypted objective updates on their spectacular collapse, delivered with the same dispassionate tone he used for operational briefings. I was executing the starvation tactic, a brutal but highly necessary psychological doctrine designed to let the enemy rot in the mess they created until they surrendered unconditionally. As I sat in my cramped quarters on the ship reading Vance's report about my brother-in-law desperately shoveling snow for minimum wage, a man who had once sat at my Christmas table laughing at my career and calling me a glorified government janitor, I felt a fleeting, painful pang of guilt tighten in my chest. An old, deeply ingrained habit of my overprotective nature, the ghost of my mother's dying command still pulling at the chains. But I quickly and violently suffocated it with logic and discipline. I knew that if I intervened now, if I sent even a single dollar of relief or a single text message of comfort, the terminal disease of their entitlement would never be cured. The infection would return stronger and more resistant. They had to feel the burn. They had to feel it deep enough to scar. I finally returned to the mainland from the total blackout of my classified mission, expecting the starvation tactic to have taught them silence and humility. Instead, my loyal subordinate immediately briefed me on a venomous, desperate counterattack that made my blood run cold with a fury I had not felt since the Christmas dinner. Refusing to accept defeat, my sister had taken to social media, posting a highly calculated, tear-drenched essay about her worst holiday ever. In the post, she masterfully painted me as a ruthless, cold-blooded military monster who had abused my federal authority to maliciously freeze a helpless family's bank accounts in the dead of winter, leaving innocent children to starve. She claimed I was hoarding our dead mother's inheritance. She claimed I had threatened her with armed soldiers. Every word was a precision lie wrapped in enough truth to be believable. The toxic narrative spread like a virus through the local community, rapidly weaponizing the neighborhood against me. Mothers who had never met me were calling me a monster. She was using the exact same psychological warfare she had perfected when we were children, playing the helpless victim to mask her own horrific abuse, and the audience was eating it alive. The head of the local PTA, Linda Sterling, a woman who thrived on suburban drama, the way my sister thrived on designer bags, spearheaded the neighborhood gossip campaign with terrifying enthusiasm. She publicly branded me a cruel, abusive aunt on her community newsletter, riling up the neighborhood mothers with dramatic, exaggerated retellings of my sister's fabricated trauma. A visceral flashback hit me as I read Linda's post. I was 12 years old again, standing in our cramped kitchen watching my sister sob crocodile tears into our mother's apron, claiming I had hit her. I had not touched her. She had broken our mother's favorite ceramic vase trying to steal cookies from the top shelf. But the tears worked. They always worked. Our mother slapped me across the face without asking a single question, and my sister smirked at me from behind her back. 25 years later, the playbook was identical. Only the audience had grown larger. My blood boiled instantly, turning into a cold, lethal, calculated fury. I did not post a pathetic rebuttal online. I did not engage in a digital screaming match with anonymous housewives. I prepared a surgical, irrefutable, physical counterstrike designed to destroy her false narrative permanently in person, in front of the very community she had weaponized against me. I marched into the crowded community New Year's gathering wearing my full immaculate dress uniform, every crease, razor sharp, my medals gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. The noisy room fell dead silent as I strode down the center aisle, the crowd parting for me out of sheer intimidation. My boots echoed on the tile floor. Every head turned as Linda Sterling loudly began to condemn my cruelty from the front of the room. Clutching a printout of my sister's sob story like a battle flag, I walked straight up to her podium. Without uttering a single word of emotional defense, I aggressively slammed my certified bank-stamped financial statements directly onto her table. The impact scattered her papers across the floor. I coldly and loudly read off the exact astronomical amounts, the private school tuitions, the condo deposits, the car payments, the resort vacations, every dollar I had paid for over 15 years, reading each number slowly and clearly, so every person in that room could hear the full weight of my sacrifice. I looked Linda dead in the eye as she scanned the verified bank-authenticated numbers. Linda turned white as a sheet, her mouth opening and closing without sound, backing away in profound, stuttering shame as she realized she had championed a con artist. The final devastating nail in the coffin arrived from the back of the room. I had covertly invited James Mitchell, the manager of the luxury car showroom, asking him to bring only his records and his honesty. Seeing the documents on the table, he stepped out from the crowd, a tall, plain-spoken man in a gray sport coat who had no interest in neighborhood politics. He did not whisper. He projected his voice so every single PTA member could hear clearly. That repossessed Porsche wasn't hers. he loudly announced to the stunned crowd. It was entirely funded and guaranteed by Commander Catherine Perez. Olivia missed 3 payments the second her sister's money stopped. The room erupted in gasps and furious murmuring. My sister's fragile web of lies shattered instantly into a million irreparable pieces. She stood frozen in the back row, her face a sickly gray, her hands clutching the chair in front of her so tightly her knuckles went white. I stepped forward, refusing to stand passively. I locked eyes with my sister, delivering the final execution order. Your fake empire is dead, Olivia. You have nothing left to hide behind. The crowd turned their disgusted stares toward her, and she shrank away completely destroyed. Linda Sterling walked out of the room without looking at anyone, her credibility shattered alongside my sister's lies. If you feel a profound sense of justice seeing this arrogant manipulator finally face the brutal consequences of her lies in public, please like this video. I would love for you to share in the comments your own experiences of exposing toxic relatives. Shortly after the disastrous community meeting, the ultimate unavoidable financial consequence arrived at their doorstep. The bank dispatched an officer to slap a bright red legally binding 30-day foreclosure notice squarely on the front door of their sprawling mansion. The adhesive tore the paint when the officer pressed it into place, leaving a raw, exposed patch of wood beneath the pristine white exterior. Inside the house, the situation was increasingly dire. The heat had been shut off due to months of unpaid utility bills. The water was running on a final grace period. The giant, ostentatious Christmas tree from that fateful dinner, the exact one where she had insulted me surrounded by expensive gifts I paid for, now sat completely dead and withering in the freezing living room. It dropped dry brown needles onto the expensive Persian rug with a faint crackling sound, the branches sagging under the weight of unpaid ornaments. A crystal angel dangled from the top branch, tilted sideways, catching the gray light from the uncurtained windows. It stood as a perfect, pathetic physical symbol of their decaying fake life, rotting from the inside out, while they froze in the dark. Inside the freezing dark house, their marriage violently fractured under the immense pressure of poverty. Blame was thrown like venomous daggers across the cold room. The first night the heat went out, they slept in their coats, piling every blanket in the house onto the children's beds and shivering through the darkness with nothing between them but a toxic, suffocating silence. By the second week, the silence had erupted into vicious, screaming matches that echoed off the empty walls. The illusion of their perfect social media-worthy love was brutally stripped away by empty stomachs and freezing temperatures. According to Vance's report, the neighbors called the police twice for noise complaints. My brother-in-law accused my sister of spending too recklessly, pointing at the closet still stuffed with designer clothing they could not eat. My sister accused him of being too pathetic to earn a real salary, reminding him that every man on her social media feed drove a better car than the bus he now rode. He fired back the truth. She could not stand to hear that her entire lifestyle was built on my stolen money, not his, and that she had never earned a single dollar of the luxury she flaunted online. She slapped him across the face hard enough to leave a red handprint on his cheek, and told him he was less of a man than the janitor at her daughter's school. He grabbed his thin jacket and walked out the front door, slamming it so hard the foreclosure notice taped to the outside fluttered to the ground. The children huddled upstairs in the dark, listening to every word through the thin walls. Sitting in my warm, highly secure study across town, I read Vance's detailed reports on the deterioration and reflected on the years I had spent constantly shielding them from the consequences of their own choices. Every time a bill went unpaid, I paid it before the late fee hit. Every time a crisis erupted, I solved it with a single wire transfer. Every time they overspent, I silently absorbed the damage without a word of complaint. I had been their emergency response team, their insurance policy, their bottomless safety net. And they had repaid me by calling me a broke, pathetic soldier at their Christmas table. I realized now that my absence and this excruciating pain they were suffering was the greatest and most necessary teacher they would ever have. I had to let the fire burn them entirely, so they finally learned to respect the devastating heat. Driving home after a late, grueling shift, I paused my truck across the street from the local supermarket. Through the frosted glass, I watched my brother-in-law exhaustedly counting dirty change at the register, his face hollow gray and completely defeated. A customer tossed a crumpled receipt at him and he picked it up from the counter without protest. My heart ached profoundly, not for the adults who had earned this hell through their own arrogance, but for the innocent children trapped inside it. Tommy and Emma had done nothing wrong. They had not asked for designer bags or Porsches. They had not insulted my career or exploited my salary. They were casualties of a war they did not start. I immediately contacted my loyal subordinate on the encrypted channel. I covertly ordered Vance to purchase and deliver heavy winter coats, insulated boots, and highly nutritious non-perishable food directly to my niece and nephew at their school. I explicitly instructed the school administration to keep the donor strictly anonymous. No card, no note, no trace back to me. I ensured the children never suffered the physical bite of this war, protecting the innocent while punishing the guilty. It was the only compromise my conscience would allow, and I made it without hesitation. Despite securing the children's physical safety, I maintained my absolute unbroken zero-contact rule with my sister and her husband. They had to hit rock bottom. They had to feel the terrifying, suffocating abyss of losing everything they arrogantly believed they were inherently owed. I sat in the dark shadows of my truck cabin, the engine idling quietly, maintaining a silent, cold vigil over their destruction. I watched my brother-in-law finish his grueling shift, zip up a thin jacket that was laughably inadequate for the freezing temperatures, and trudge out into the biting wind toward the bus stop, his car long gone repossessed along with his wife's Porsche. He stood alone under a flickering streetlight, stamping his feet to keep warm, a man who had once mocked my pension, now praying for a bus to arrive before his fingers went numb. I was waiting patiently for the inevitable moment their arrogant pride finally snapped in half under the crushing, undeniable weight of reality. The end was near. During a violent late-night blizzard, my heavy oak doorbell rang incessantly. The sound cut through the quiet of my house like an alarm sharp, and desperate someone leaning on the button with their full weight. I set down the book I was reading, a dog-eared paperback I had carried through 3 deployments, crossed to the front door, and opened it. My brother-in-law stood on my porch, shivering violently in his cheap, wet supermarket uniform, completely soaked through to the bone. His name tag was still pinned to his chest, the plastic slightly cracked, his employee name printed in faded block letters. His lips were tinged blue. A plastic grocery bag dangled from his left hand, holding what appeared to be a half-eaten sleeve of store-brand crackers and a bruised apple, the remnants of a break-room meal that was clearly all he had eaten that day. The man who once laughed at my military career, the man who proudly mocked my pension and called me a glorified government employee at my own Christmas table, was completely broken. He wept openly, his tears mixing with the freezing snow melting on his face. His shoulders shook with the kind of sobs that come not from sadness, but from total surrender, from a man whose pride had been ground into powder and swallowed with the bitter taste of cold reality. He did not try to justify his actions. He did not make excuses. He did not try to gaslight me or spin a narrative. He did not mention my sister's name or attempt to broker a deal on her behalf. He spoke only for himself. I was a coward, Catherine. He sobbed, finally speaking the absolute pathetic truth directly to my face. I failed to protect my own kids, and I let her use you because I was too weak to earn my own living. Please, we have nothing left. We are starving. He admitted he was entirely wrong to enable the abuse. He admitted he had known what my sister was doing with my money and had never once tried to stop her because the lifestyle was too comfortable to question. He told me he had watched her forge emergency stories to milk more money from my deployments and had said nothing. He told me he had overheard her laughing on the phone to her friend about how gullible the soldier was, and he had swallowed his shame and poured himself another glass of wine that I had unknowingly purchased. I listened in absolute silence, my arms crossed, my back straight, letting his agonizing apologies vanish into the freezing wind without offering a shred of comfort or a single word of reassurance. I watched his tears fall onto my doormat and freeze into tiny crystals. Then I stepped aside and let him enter my warm hallway, but nothing more. No food, no coffee, no embrace. He sat on the bench by my door, dripping melted snow onto the tile, and waited. The very next morning, the true architect of the disaster arrived. My sister slowly walked up my driveway. She was utterly unrecognizable. Stripped of her heavy contour makeup, her expensive designer bags, her perfectly maintained blowout, and her arrogant sneer, she was a hollow, terrified shell of a woman. Her hair hung limp and unwashed around her gaunt face. Her coat was the same cashmere one she had worn during the repo, now stained and pilling at the cuffs. She collapsed heavily to her knees in the thick, freezing snow on my front porch, screaming hysterically. She grabbed the fabric of my uniform pants, begging me to save her children from the horrifying reality of sleeping in a homeless shelter. Please, Catherine. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Don't let them take the house, I'll do anything. She wailed, her voice cracking, desperate for the unconditional savior she had murdered months ago. She looked up at me with terrified eyes, her makeup-free face blotchy and swollen, and I could see the exact moment she realized that her fake tears and manipulative gaslighting no longer had any effect on the soldier standing before her. The old Catherine, the one who would have crumbled at the first sob, was gone. I looked down at the pathetic kneeling woman who had bled me dry for 15 grueling years. I did not flinch. I did not kneel in the snow to hug her. I pried her freezing hands off my uniform and took a deliberate step back, exuding the untouchable authority of an officer who had made her decision long before this moment arrived. I reached into the breast pocket of my heavy military coat and pulled out a thick, legally binding document I had my lawyers draft weeks ago, anticipating this exact scenario. These are the surrender terms, I stated with surgical precision, my voice entirely devoid of pity or sisterly affection. I demanded they both enter my house to hear their final, unnegotiable fate. They staggered inside, tracking snow onto the floor, sitting side by side like condemned prisoners on my couch. My brother-in-law could not even meet my gaze. My sister clutched the hem of her stained coat and stared at the floor. I stood over them, dictating the strict, unbreakable rules of their survival. First, I will establish an independent education and medical fund for Tommy and Emma, but you will pay for every living expense, mortgage, and car payment from your own earned wages. Not a single cent from my account will ever touch your pockets again. I leaned forward, locking eyes with my sister to deliver the final, devastating psychological blow. Second, Olivia, you will record a public video retracting your lies, formally apologizing to me, and admitting to 15 years of financial parasitism. She gasped in sheer horror, clutching her chest as her deepest fear, public humiliation, was realized. Her mouth opened to protest, but the words died in her throat. She looked at her husband. He stared at the floor. She looked at the foreclosure countdown ticking in her mind. She looked at the thick legal document in my hand. The trap was securely closed. They had absolutely no choice but to surrender. The morning of the bank's final non-negotiable deadline arrived. Less than 24 hours remained before the foreclosure would be aggressively executed by the sheriff, resulting in their physical eviction into the freezing street. The atmosphere in my living room was suffocatingly heavy, tense with the dark reality of impending homelessness. My sister and her husband sat rigidly at my dining table, their hands trembling violently. My sister wiped away tears of profound, agonizing humiliation as she slowly picked up the heavy metal pen I provided. She read through the strict legal jargon that stripped away her access to my money forever, her lips moving silently over each clause. The reality of her absolute unconditional defeat crushed down on her shoulders. She realized she would have to work a real job for the rest of her life. No more sponsored brunches, no more designer unboxing videos, no more lies. She pressed the pen to the thick paper, signing her name with a shaky hand, the ink wobbling across the signature line like the heartbeat of a dying machine. Legally binding herself to a life of grueling, unassisted independence. No more phantom emergencies, no more fabricated school fees, no more first-class flights disguised as hospital bills. Her husband signed immediately after her, his signature barely legible through his trembling, the pen nearly slipping from his blistered, work-roughened fingers. They formally legally accepted the total destruction of their lavish lifestyle, with 2 signatures that took less than 10 seconds to execute, ending a parasitic arrangement that had consumed 15 years of my life and over $1 million of my earned income. As I carefully verified the signatures, ensuring every initial was in place, every date correctly written, and every clause legally airtight, I slowly pulled out my checkbook. The leather cover was worn smooth from years of use, each previous check in its register, a record of my disciplined, carefully managed financial life. I wrote the exact, carefully calculated amount needed to halt the foreclosure, enough to satisfy the bank and prevent the sheriff's eviction, not a single penny more for luxury comfort, a new wardrobe, or a celebratory dinner. I tore the check along its perforated edge with a slow, deliberate pull and stared at the blue ink drying on the paper, the numbers stark and final against the pale green background. This was the last check I would ever write with their names anywhere near the transaction. The last price of my permanent financial freedom from their parasitic grip. I tore the check from the book and tossed it onto the center of the wooden table. The sharp slapping sound of the paper hitting the wood was deafening in the silent room, causing both of them to jump. My eyes sliced through them. Tiki, this is the last time the military resupplies this family. I commanded, my voice, echoing with terrifying finality. The crushing weight of that sentence obliterated the last lingering remnants of their parasitic entitlement. They stared down at the check, the blue ink still wet, realizing the endless magical well of my salary had finally run completely dry. If they ever fell behind on their mortgage again, I would let the bank take the house without a second thought. This was not a threat. This was a fact. I crossed my arms and stood directly over my sister, coldly supervising her as she picked up her smartphone and activated the camera. Choking on her tears, her face bare and utterly defeated, she pressed record. The red dot blinked. She did not just cry. She confessed. I lied to all of you. She sobbed to the lens. I leached off my sister's military salary for 15 years to fund a fake lifestyle. She is not a monster. I was the parasite. I am deeply sorry for slandering her. She publicly admitted her parasitism to the world, completely retracting her victim narrative and apologizing for her horrific lies. Her voice cracked on the word parasite. Her hands shook so badly the camera wobbled. But every word was recorded. Every confession was captured. The mask was permanently destroyed. The catharsis I felt was absolute. Time flowed forward, slowly carrying away the toxic wreckage of our past. The brutal, unforgiving winter finally melted into a bright, warm Easter Sunday. Several months had passed since the surrender contract was signed in my living room. The agonizing silence and the electric hostile tension between us had slowly healed into a cautious, deeply earned respect. We gathered at their home for a modest, quiet spring dinner. The atmosphere was entirely devoid of the toxic arrogance, materialistic obsession, and cruel mockery that had poisoned the previous Christmas dinner. The air inside the house felt remarkably light, as if a dark, suffocating curse had finally been lifted from the family's shoulders. We were no longer a commander and her prisoners. We were cautiously becoming a family again. My brother-in-law stood proudly in the kitchen, a completely transformed man. He was no longer wearing expensive, unearned designer suits or attempting to act like a wealthy executive at cocktail parties funded by my stolen deployments. He was now a proud shift manager at the supermarket, promoted after 3 months of arriving early and staying late without complaint, his original polyester cashier uniform replaced by a slightly nicer company shirt with his title embroidered neatly on the pocket. He had framed his first real paycheck stub and hung it on the refrigerator next to the children's school drawings, a small act that spoke louder than any apology he could ever verbalize. He spoke with the quiet, grounded dignity of a man who finally earned his own bread through hard labor. His hands were calloused. Now the blisters from his first day of shoveling healed into tough, honest skin. When he shook my hand at the door, his grip was firm and unashamed, the handshake of a man who no longer needed to pretend. My sister, completely devoid of her fake glamour, heavy makeup, and social media obsession, was actually cooking a simple, hearty meal with genuine care. Her hands showed the slight signs of real domestic work, flour dusted on her wrists, a small burn mark on her thumb from the oven rack. She had taken a part-time administrative job at a dental office and was studying for a certification in the evenings after the children went to bed. The designer wardrobe that had once consumed an entire walk-in closet had been sold at a consignment shop, the proceeds applied directly to their overdue utility bills. She did not take out her phone once to post a picture of the food. She did not arrange the plates for optimal lighting or ask anyone to hold their fork midair while she captured the perfect angle. The modest meal, a slow-cooked pot roast with root vegetables and homemade rolls, tasted infinitely better than any pretentious luxury catering they had ever bought with my stolen money. It tasted like something real. The children ran excitedly into the dining room, their innocent laughter filling the house with a sound that had been absent for far too long. Tommy, my 12-year-old nephew, pulled out my chair for me before sitting down himself, a small gesture of respect his father had clearly taught him. He had grown taller over the past few months, his face thinner, but his eyes were bright and clear, no longer carrying the anxious, confused look of a boy trapped in a house full of screaming adults. He told me quietly, almost shyly, that he was getting straight A's in school and had joined the track team. He told me he wanted to earn things himself from now on, not have them given to him. I nodded at him, and he sat up a little straighter in his chair. My niece Emma rushed up to me, her eyes wide with pure, unadulterated admiration. She did not ask me for a new toy or a shopping trip. She did not mention a single brand name or beg to go to the mall. Instead, she gently traced the colorful military ribbons pinned to the chest of my uniform, her small fingers carefully touching each one fully, understanding what they represented now, after seeing the strength it had taken to save this family from itself. "Aunt Catherine, I am so proud of you," she whispered, hugging my waist tightly. I smiled. A real profound smile that finally reached my eyes, the first one that had done so since before that Christmas dinner. My hand rested gently on the back of her head, and I held her for a long moment, letting the warmth of her small arms around my waist slowly thaw the last frozen edges of a heart that had spent 15 years encased in duty and pain. The heavy, suffocating burden of financial exploitation finally lifted from my shoulders, dissipating entirely into the warm spring air. Looking around the room at my profoundly transformed family, at the shift manager who had found his dignity in honest labor, at the sister who had finally learned the true cost of a meal she cooked with her own hands, at the children who laughed, not because they had new toys, but because they had two parents finally present in the same room without screaming. The ultimate truth settled peacefully in my heart. I realized I did not destroy my family with the starvation tactic. I saved them from themselves. By enforcing brutal, uncompromising discipline, I cured their terminal disease of entitlement. My mother's dying promise was finally truly honored the way it was meant to be. She had not asked me to bankroll a con artist. She had asked me to take care of my sister, and taking care of someone sometimes means forcing them to stand on their own feet, even when they scream and beg you to carry them. I stood in the warm golden sunlight streaming through the window, feeling the heat on my face, knowing that I had forged a permanent legacy of true strength, mutual respect, and absolute independence. The long, bitter winter was over. The healing was finally complete. If this grueling journey of transforming deep family betrayal into a healed, self-sufficient reality inspired you, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more true stories of resilience. Do not hesitate to share your own memories of overcoming family manipulation in the comments below.